Christians, Jesus was not sacrificed for your sins. He was brutally executed by the Romans for claiming to be a king within Roman territory. And he wasn't sacrificed by the Jews of the time to absolve anyone's sins, as they too didn't see him as their king, which was a claim he was making, not them. I previously made a video about the top 10 reasons Jesus was not sacrificed for your sins. Click here if you'd like to see that video. If you enjoyed the full video countdown, you're going to love this series where we break down each point in detail, starting with number 10 on that list. The Romans, not priests, performed the crucifixion. Let's get into it. Let's start by setting the stage. What actually qualifies as a sacrifice in the context of ancient Judaism? In the Old Testament, sacrifices were a carefully defined ritual. They had to be performed by a priest, a member of the Levitical priesthood, in a sacred space like the temple in Jerusalem. This wasn't just a casual process. It followed strict laws laid out in texts like Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Whether it was a sin offering, a peace offering, or a burnt offering, the priests were central to the process, acting as intermediaries between the people and God. Now, compare that to what happened during Jesus' crucifixion. Who were the key players? Roman soldiers. They were the ones who arrested Jesus, beat him, mocked him, and ultimately nailed him to a cross. These weren't priests, and they certainly weren't performing a religious act. They were agents of the Roman Empire doing what they were trained to do, carry out a public execution in order to maintain order and suppress a rebellion. Let's take a closer look at why this distinction matters. Sacrifices in Jewish tradition weren't random acts of violence. They were intentional acts of worship meant to reconcile people with God. The priests would slaughter animals on an altar in a specific way, and the blood of the sacrifice was considered sacred. It was about purification, atonement, and holiness. The crucifixion of Jesus, on the other hand, was a brutal display of Roman power. There was no altar, no priests, and no ritual. Just soldiers carrying out a punishment for a crime the state believed he committed. And what crime was that? The Romans crucified Jesus because they viewed him as a political threat. He was accused of claiming to be the king of the Jews, which was seen as a challenge to Roman authority. Crucifixion wasn't even a Jewish method of execution. It was a Roman one, designed to publicly humiliate and deter others from challenging their rule. In fact, the Jewish leaders at the time weren't even allowed to carry out executions under Roman law. They had to hand Jesus over to the Romans, which is why we see Pontius Pilate involved in the story. And in the case of those Jews, Jesus asking God to forgive them for they know not what they do is more evidence they weren't sacrificing him. So if the crucifixion was carried out by Roman soldiers, can it really be called a sacrifice? Let's think about this critically. Sacrifices are offerings made to a deity, but the soldiers who crucified Jesus weren't making an offering to God. They were just doing their job, executing someone they saw as a criminal. There was no intent to fulfill any religious obligations, no prayers offered, no sanctity involved. The whole process was gruesome, chaotic, and anything but sacred. Now, some Christians may argue that it doesn't matter who carried out the act because Jesus himself was the sacrifice. But even if we entertain that argument, the fact that Roman soldiers were the ones who executed him complicates things. According to Jewish tradition, the person performing the sacrifice matters. It's not just about what is sacrificed, it's about who offers it and how it's done. The priests were trained and consecrated specifically for this role, and their involvement was seen as essential for the sacrifice to be valid. Without priests, the act simply doesn't meet the requirements of a sacrifice. Let's also talk about the setting. Sacrifices in Jewish tradition had to take place in specific holy locations, like the temple in Jerusalem. But Jesus was crucified outside the city walls on a hill called Golgotha. This was a public execution site, not a sacred space. The contrast could not be starker. On one hand, you have the temple, a place of reverence and worship. On the other hand, you have Golgotha, a place of shame and death. How can an execution in such a place be considered a holy sacrifice? Then there's also the question of intent. The Romans weren't acting out of religious devotion or trying to fulfill God's plan. They were punishing someone they saw as a troublemaker. In fact, they mocked Jesus throughout the process, dressing him in a robe, placing a crown of thorns on his head, and sarcastically calling him the King of the Jews. These actions highlight the complete lack of reverence in the crucifixion. It was not a sacred act. It was a cruel, violent joke at Jesus' expense. Another important point to consider is the role of the Jewish leaders in the story. While they may have pushed for Jesus' execution, they didn't carry it out themselves. Why? Well, again, because they weren't allowed to. Under Roman occupation, the power to execute someone rested solely with the Roman authorities. This fact underscores the political nature of Jesus' death. It was a state-sanctioned killing, not a religious offering. So where does this leave us? When you strip away the theological narrative and look at the historical context, it becomes clear that Jesus' death was an execution, not a sacrifice. The people who carried it out were Roman soldiers, not Jewish priests. The setting was a place of public shame, not a holy sanctuary, and the intent was to punish a perceived political threat, not to make an offering to God. Hey, now don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you like what I do, share this video on your social media. It really helps. Now, on with the show. So, to call Jesus' death a sacrifice requires a significant redefinition of what a sacrifice is. You have to ignore almost every aspect of a sacrifice: the role of the priests, the sacred rituals, the holy setting, and the intent behind the act. Instead, you're left with a story of political violence and state power dressed up in religious language to serve a theological agenda. If you want to see the original video, the top 10 reasons Jesus' crucifixion was not a sacrifice, click down here. Click over here if you want to see my video on the top 10 reasons the God of the Bible is more like a pit demon than a loving father figure. Sin safely, my friends. Take care.